Ready? Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Let My People Go, an interfaith conference on mass incarceration here at Yale University, specifically Yale Divinity School, hosted by Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship. My name is Mpilo Jordan Norris. I'm a sophomore at Yale studying biomedical engineering and economics, and I currently serve as the rector and undergraduate president of Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship. I've grown up in the Seventh-day Adventist Church. I've been heavily involved doing preaching and counseling for a diverse amount of audiences around the globe, and I'm extremely excited to be with you here today.
And my name is Stephen Eric. I'm a second-year Master of Arts in Religion student at Yale Divinity School and leader of the graduate student portion of the Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship. I'm also a lifelong Adventist, and I'm just so excited to bring all of the different people together that we're having this weekend for this incredible conference. We're the organizers of this event, and we will be your hosts throughout the conference.
Awesome. So just a little bit more information on that to come soon. Now, we are overflowing with excitement for the exquisite lineup of presentations over the next couple of days, and we want to get to that as soon as possible. However, before we get started, I think it would be appropriate to just share just a little bit of who we are and what brings us all here today. Locally, us as the Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship, we worship and we partner with local church congregations here in the New Haven area, namely the New Haven Seventh-day Adventist Church and the Mount Zion Seventh-day Adventist Church. But Adventism is a global organization, a global Protestant Christian denomination with millions around the globe. In fact, our organization, Adventist Campus Fellowship, is a chapter of a national network of Adventist collegiate organizations throughout the world. But many in the audience may still be wondering, who are Seventh-day Adventists and what sets us apart? Let me tell you. The term Adventist suggests that we are focused on the advent or the coming of Jesus Christ. We believe that he will return to this world to set up a kingdom of righteousness and peace for all. But that doesn't just mean that we can sit back idle and wait for Christ to come. We as Adventists are admonished to be a light in a world of darkness, so as to prepare the hearts of all of humanity for the glory of God. In the Bible, God commands us to seek justice, defend the oppressed, and set the captives free. In the words of Seventh-day Adventist Sojourner Truth, religion without humanity is very poor human stuff. You see, God is not satisfied when black men are pinned by the neck to the ground and choked to their death. He is not satisfied when the poor and misfortunate are exploited and incarcerated for profit, nor is he satisfied when beautiful skin that he has made is turned into a crime. So all that we do as an Adventist Campus Fellowship, whether it be feeding the homeless, visiting the sick, caring for the poor, and all the other ministries, is to prepare this world for the reign of righteousness that will destroy today's governments of corruption, violence, hate, and dysfunction. But I believe all of us gathered here today, despite our religious or ideological differences, are those very lights that will dispel the darkness in this world. Each of us here has a burning desire to flip the world upside down with the truth. And that is why we have decided to gather us all here together as one. And we are so very thankful for what is about to take place. So we'll give you a few instructions on what to expect, and we're going to get right into it.
Thanks, Mpilo. To get the most out of this conference, we've tried to make access as easy as possible. For those of you with Zoom tickets, you should have received an email on Thursday evening with 5 unique Zoom links. Just select the link for the appropriate program a few minutes before it starts, and you will be in. If you have to step out for any reason during the meeting, you will be able to come back in using that same link. We will re-email out the same list of links tomorrow and Sunday to keep it at the top of your inbox. For those without Zoom access, we're pleased to announce that the conference is being streamed live on YouTube. You should have received a link for the Yale ACF YouTube channel on Thursday evening as well. Feel free to share that with anyone else who would like to participate. At any point in the weekend, if you have difficulty accessing the event, please don't hesitate to reach out to Mpilo or me via our emails, which we will post in the chat, or by clicking to contact the organizer on the Eventbrite page. One of the most exciting things about this conference is how international it is. Right now, we're being interpreted live into Spanish and Portuguese by a team of top-notch interpreters. If you're watching in Zoom, you'll see a small globe on the bottom of your screen, and if you click into it, you'll have the option to choose your language. If hearing both voices is distracting, you can click Mute Original Audio, and you will only hear the language of your choosing. We want to find out, knowing that this is such an international conference, where our audience is coming from. And this will give us a chance to test another feature of Zoom webinars. At the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button. And right now, I would just like to invite anyone in the Zoom webinar to click the Q&A button and just type in where you are watching from. I just want to get a feel for where you're coming from. And someone has already done it. We want to welcome Livian from Maceió in Alagoas, Brazil. We want to also welcome Faith from Indiana, Luke from right here in New Haven, Connecticut. We've got more people from Brazil, from Colorado, from Washington, D.C. Wow, it just keeps coming in. Pennsylvania, Maryland. John, so good to see you.
I think I see my aunt in there. Hi, Aunt Leslie.
Yep.
Good to see you.
Okay. I see Washington State.
Ben Dormis, great to see you.
Oh, wow. Tennessee. So we're just blown away by how far that this conference is reaching. People across the U.S. and across the world. And we just want to give a warm welcome to every one of you. As the event starts, one other thing I would like to share is that I want to encourage you to take notes and prepare to ask questions, because towards the end of this presentation and many of the presentations this weekend, you will have the opportunity to submit your questions to the panelists for a response. And you can use that same Q&A feature to do that. So please take notes, get questions ready, and pass those along whenever they strike you throughout the conference.
Awesome. So let's get right into it. As you know, our theme for this entire weekend is called Let My People Go. And it's an interfaith conference, meaning we have not only Seventh-day Adventist voices, we have Christian voices, we have Jewish voices, Muslim voices, Buddhist voices, a large spectrum of religious ideologies that are coming together as one. We also have people from a variety of different academic backgrounds, lawyers, religious leaders, student activists, and so much more that you're going to see throughout the conference. We're so excited. Now, given that we are such a diverse group, that does mean that we aren't necessarily going to agree on every single topic, on every single idea, and every single ideology. And that's okay. That's the point of this conference. Now, what that does mean for you and for us is that all the views expressed here don't necessarily reflect the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, but we can assure you that we are lockstep in the fight to bring a more justice to our world. So Steve is going to introduce our first topic for tonight, and then we're going to get right into it.
Yeah, so tonight we are having a panel that is trying to just set the stage for everything we're going to do this weekend. The title of the panel is The Issue in Context, the United States Criminal Justice System. And to guide us through this topic, we have three fantastic presenters, as well as a very special moderator who has just been a huge encouragement to us from the beginning of the planning process. So I will introduce the moderator for this session, and then she will go on to introduce the presenters, and the panel will begin. So Dr. Elizabeth Hinton is a professor here at our very own Yale Law School, as well as a professor in the African American Studies Department. She focuses on the persistence of poverty, racial inequality, and urban violence in the 20th century United States, and is considered one of the nation's leading experts on criminalization and policing. Dr. Hinton completed her PhD in United States history from Columbia University in 2013, and it is our privilege right now to welcome her and the rest of the panelists to the stage.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and to Mapilo and you, Stephen, for organizing this amazing conference, the Yale Adventist Campus Fellowship for sponsoring, and of course, all of you for joining us from around the country and around the world for this very important set of discussions this weekend. Our panel this evening is titled The Issue and Context, the United States Criminal Justice System. And I'm going to briefly introduce our panelists. As Stephen said, they're going to present for about 20 minutes, and then we're going to jump right into discussion. So I encourage you to, as soon as something that they say sparks something in you, please submit your questions in the Q&A. There's a lot of people on. I know more people are going to be coming on, and we really want to make this a free-flowing conversation. And you came here to get some of your questions answered. So I am so excited to hear from our distinguished panelists tonight. First, we'll hear from Miriam Gohara. Miriam Gohara is a clinical associate professor of law at Yale Law School. She has a JD from Harvard Law and a degree from Columbia University. Professor Gohara spent 16 years representing death sentence clients in post-conviction litigation, first as assistant counsel at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and then as a specially designated federal public defender with the Federal Capital Habeas Project. Recently, on January 15, 2021, Professor Gohara, along with her clinic students, won a major legal victory. Judge David Gold of the Hartford Superior Court resentenced Clyde Michael, a Yale Law School challenging mass incarceration clinic client, for 28 years from the 50 to which he was originally sentenced. Next, we'll hear from Nicholas Miller, who received his BA in theology from Pacific Union College and a JD from Columbia University Law School. He also has a PhD in American religious and legal history from the University of Notre Dame. Dr. Miller has argued many church and state cases in state and federal courts, has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Mitchell versus Helms, and is the author of numerous writings dealing with issues of church, state, and society. And of course, last but not least, we'll hear from Keesha Middlemass, who is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Howard University. Middlemass focuses on the dynamics of prisoner reentry, punishment, and racial justice. Her work on food insecurity within the returning prison population has been published in numerous public health journals. Middlemass holds an MA in American Politics and a PhD in Public Policy, American Politics, and Public Administration from the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our first presenter, Dr. Miriam Gohara.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth and Stephen and Pilo and all the organizers and sponsors of this event. I'm really happy to be in conversation with all of you. So when Impilo approached me to have this conversation, I immediately agreed. And part of the reason I agreed is because the issue of mercy and grace comes up so often in my work, and it seems like such a critical theme for a conference that is among people of faith discussing the state of our criminal legal system here in the United States. So as Professor Hinton mentioned at the beginning, I've spent the better part of my career representing people who are sentenced to death. And more recently, since I've joined Yale Law School, I've begun to extend the type of representation that I've done on behalf of capitally sentenced clients to clients who are not facing death sentences, but who are nevertheless either serving long sentences in prison or are facing long prison sentences. So I work along with Yale Law students to provide the best possible representation that we can to this set of people who, in our view, are especially vulnerable. So mercy is a very pervasive theme, as I said, in our work, but also in Christianity, right? And I know that this conference is organized by a Christian organization. So as I started to think about this, I began to think about some of my own, experiences and resonances and exposure to the idea of mercy. And I grew up personally as an Orthodox Christian, Coptic Christian. My parents immigrated from Egypt as essentially refugees from religious persecution. And so I'm very well familiar with concepts of mercy and grace in the Bible. And what came to mind for me was the verse from Matthew 5:7, which is, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy." And I started to think again, as I do often, about these ideas of grace and mercy in our work and how we think about them applying in the criminal legal system. When you're advocating for people who are facing the death penalty, the idea of mercy is essential to saving their lives, whether that's asking a jury to spare them from the death penalty or asking a judge later to set aside a death sentence to which they've already been convicted and sentenced. So obviously, whenever I tell my students this all the time, whenever we're working with our clients, all of whom have been convicted of very serious offenses, we're talking about tragedy and we're talking about harm, and we're talking about it all around. Each case inherently involves tragedy, and it involves harm, and it involves grievous harm to people, some of whom have lost their lives. And so we have to think about, when somebody has committed the worst possible offense another person can commit against somebody else, what do they deserve? And how do we think about the idea of grace and mercy when we think about punishment? And I used to think that grace and mercy, when we think about punishment, especially when somebody has killed another person or committed another grievous offense, means that we need to beg for those. We need to beg a jury. We need to beg a judge. And then the more and more I started to learn about my clients' experiences and teach students how to investigate and learn about our clients' lives and their social histories, I realized that concept is a little bit upside down, and I'll explain a little bit more why. So St. Paul says in his letter to the Ephesians, "But because of his great love for us, God, who is rich in mercy, made us alive with Christ, even when we were dead in transgressions. It is by grace you have been saved." And as that quote suggests, grace or mercy suggests that somebody who is morally untouchable, right, morally above reproach, is being begged for mercy or leniency by someone who is not deserving. In that conception, grace is something that we ask for on behalf of somebody who isn't deserving, but because we are in a morally more just position than they are, we can bestow something upon them that they don't necessarily deserve, but that we're going to do out of the goodness of our hearts. That's the concept of grace or mercy. So when I started to think about this and apply it to the idea of asking for someone to spare somebody's life in the context of a capital case, or spare somebody's life from prison, or give them a significantly lower prison sentence than is generally available in the United States for very serious crimes, which we know can be as harsh as life without the possibility of parole, I started to really think about whether we were in a position to consider ourselves, or those who are sentencing our clients, morally untouchable, and therefore that whether we should really ask them and be begging them for mercy or grace. And again, as we delve into the lives of our clients, and that's what we do as lawyers and as advocates, we investigate all aspects of our clients' lives to tell a very broad story, contextualizing their experiences. And I'm very excited about the interdisciplinary nature of this panel, because we think very broadly about the idea of history. We think about it in terms of the type of work that Professor Hinton does, describing the history of communities from which economic resources have been divested. We think about it in the context of people's educational environments. We think about it in the context of the healthcare that's available to them. We try to expand the lens through which our sentencers or our judges are going to look at our clients. So rather than looking only in proximity at their offenses and what they did when they harmed somebody else, we expand the lens and want to see what happened to them and what circumstances they were living in well before they harmed anyone else. And that's where I say the question of mercy is turned on its head. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about why. Because we live in a country where we promote and tolerate conditions that we know very well are not conditions under which people can survive, can thrive, much less can succeed. We promote and tolerate conditions that we know cause harm and trauma and perpetuate cycles of poverty and violence in this country. So I'll give you a few examples. One of my first death penalty clients was a man who grew up in a very rural part of Alabama in a trailer home. And I do not exaggerate when I tell you he was tortured by his father every day. And this was a person who, until he went to prison, did not know that people brush their teeth regularly on a daily basis. That's how severe his neglect was. His family was so isolated from other people that there was no one there to protect him or the rest of his family from his father's abuse and violence. And eventually he committed an awful crime and he killed another person. And yet his sentencers, his jury, never heard anything about the circumstances of his life. He was an African-American man. He had been convicted of killing a wealthy white person. And Obviously, in Alabama, that didn't go well. Nevertheless, notwithstanding that, the jury actually sentenced the client to life. And a judge who had been appointed by segregationist Governor George Wallace overrode what Alabama calls overrode, the jury's life sentence and sentenced him to death. And nobody in the courtroom had heard any of this evidence or information about his background. And yet here was a person who, as a child, our society utterly failed to protect. Ultimately, we won relief for him because of his lawyer's failure to present basic evidence about his background. And he's now serving a life without the possibility of parole sentence, which in a world without the death penalty would nevertheless be an incredibly harsh sentence. And in many parts of the world is considered a human rights violation. But in the United States is considered a victory when somebody comes off of death row. Another example I can give you, right here in New Haven, our clinic students represented a client who was convicted of selling guns in his neighborhood. And he grew up in a very loving household, a very loving home, but they lived in a very violent community. And it was so violent that my client, our client, experienced having bullets come through his kitchen window when he was a kid, and his parents having to shield him from that. They weren't the targets. They were just happened to be in the crossfire. He similarly witnessed people in his neighborhood be shot to death and bleed out in the streets. And so even though his home was incredibly loving, he was in a community, in a neighborhood that was severely underprotected by police and yet overly surveilled. So people were often arrested for petty crimes, but there was a failure to protect them from the worst violence. So our client was traumatized, as anyone would be under these circumstances, and developed an addiction, and in order to pay for his addiction, sold a commodity that was both available and necessary for many people in his neighborhood for self-protection, and that was firearms. So what the clinic students were able to do was to persuade a judge, a federal judge, that our client, because of the circumstances and context of his life, deserved a punishment way less than what he was likely to be eligible for under the federal sentencing guidelines. And that would have been multiple years in prison. Rather than that, because our client did an extraordinary job of rehabilitating himself and getting a job and beating his addiction, the students spared him years of prison. And one of the most powerful witnesses at our client's sentencing hearing was a teacher who taught in the New Haven Public High School where he went, who came. They actually met at the funeral of another young man who had been killed, murdered in the community. And they reconnected after years of our clients having graduated from high school. And she was so concerned with our client's fate that she volunteered. She said, I want to come and speak to the judge. And she came and gave an eloquent description of the educational neglect that pervaded this high school that our client went to. And we were able to put that in contrast with the educational resources that are available to him now through the programs that he was able to access once he had been hooked in with various resources through the criminal legal system and through our representation of him. And I'm sorry to say that time and again, we find that the only time, if our clients are lucky, that resources become available to them is when they are arrested. And that's the last client that I'll mention. So Professor Hinton mentioned our client Clyde Meikle at the beginning, and we were extraordinarily pleased and proud of clinic students who won a sentencing modification for Mr. Meikle in January. He had been sentenced to 50 years in prison, and now he is eligible to be released after 28 years, having served over 26 now. And Mr. Meikle was somebody who grew up in the most violent community in Hartford, and we pled that in the sentencing modification petition to explain the context. Again, the educational and neighborhood neglect comes up again and again in our clients' lives. And this is why I say we are not above reproach when we sentence and when we punish. And Mr. Meikle went to prison having essentially been labeled by all the school systems that he had been in as a failure and someone who really was incapable of learning. And today, because of resources that were available to him behind bars, he is going to graduate from Wesleyan University with his bachelor's degree. And while it is incredibly tragic and sad that educational resources did not become available to him in any meaningful way until after he went to prison, he succeeded in making the best of what he had. And that figured prominently in the judge's decision to consider him for release. So all of these arguments that we make are designed to force sentencers or resentencers, in the case of Mr. Meikle, to consider what punishment is appropriate when we as a society have failed to protect and foster what we know every child needs to succeed. And that's why I say the concept of grace and mercy has come to feel for me like less and less relevant, because we are not above moral reproach as we continue to promote and tolerate these conditions that we know contribute to the problems that continue to ensnare the same communities, the same poor people, the same Black people, the same poor Latinx people and Native people around in the United States into the criminal legal system. So the work that the clinic students are doing is really designed to provoke the question, not what punishment somebody deserves when they've committed a terrible crime. It's really, what punishment do we deserve to impose on people when we have failed utterly to provide them with the most basic and essential needs that somebody has to even survive, much less to succeed in this country. Because after all, the Bible also admonishes us against hypocrisy. It admonishes us to take the log out of our own eye before we take the speck out of our neighbor's eye. It admonishes us that those who are without sin can cast the first stone. And the deeper and more proximate that we get to the lives of people who are actually incarcerated or facing serious incarceration, the more we realize that we have plenty of our own work to do before we are in any position to punish anyone else. And so it's consistently with these principles that we have decided rather to beg for mercy, to show and demonstrate time and again why our clients are deserving of sentences that will actually promote healing and rehabilitation and health and education, all of which have not been available to them before this process has started to unfold. So I will leave it there, and I'll be happy to answer questions during the Q&A.
Hello, I guess that's my signal then to step in and do my presentation. Nicholas Miller at Andrews University, and it's humbling to be on a panel with such amazing, highly qualified people who are directly impacting the lives of prisoners in such dramatic ways, like we just heard. And I just so appreciate the work that you've just shared with us, Dr. Gohara. My story is a little different. It's been a few years since I was so directly involved in the prison system. I still engage somewhat. My specialty is religious freedom, and in writing letters on behalf of prisoners and inmates to help facilitate their religious practices is something that I'm able to do from time to time. But in my past, there's 3 experiences that I've had that I think will help shed light on some of the broader causes that are impacting, that are moving mass incarceration forward. And they're not the really large causes like poverty and education, but maybe some of the more intermediate causes that have to do with things like militarization, the escalation of the use of force, the commercialization of the prison system. And I want to begin with an experience that I had in the DC government. I was a assistant corporation counsel at the District of Columbia government for a number of years in the early 1990s. And I had some experiences there that has really caused me to view many of the videos that we've seen over the last 10 years or so with a great deal of surprise. We've seen for the last decade or more videos of police officers using force and violence and escalating in a way which was very different from what I had been used to back in the 1990s. I represented officials of the District of Columbia government, including police officers and correctional officers. And there we were involved in understanding the appropriate use of force, and even participating in and observing the use of force for police and correctional officers. And the basic principles were fairly straightforward. You should only escalate your use of force proportionate to the threat that's given. Escalating to deadly force if there's a reasonable good faith belief in the imminent use of deadly force against oneself. And that seemed a very different standard than the pictures that we've seen of police officers choking or kneeling on the necks of unarmed men, or shooting at fleeing civilians who also are unarmed. And it's caused me to wonder what's happened over the years to cause a implementation of a system of use of force that is so different from what I understood back in the 1990s, and in fact even was involved in teaching. And I've done a little research and looking around on it, and it seems there's multiple factors in play, but certainly some important ones. In the early 2000s, you may remember our war on terror and the terrible pictures that emerged from Abu Ghraib and our prisons in Iraq, and our treatment or mistreatment of Arab prisoners, Muslim prisoners, with abusive tactics that we undertook there. And I really think there's something to the notion that the way you treat your enemies abroad soon becomes the way that you treat your own people at home. And there are reasons to believe that there is quite a direct connection between those events. Returning military veterans make up about 6% of the US population, but make up about 20% of police and correctional forces in the United States. So you're likely to have a much higher percentage of former military members in domestic police forces. And they come with a very different set of rules of engagement. When you are a military overseeing a hostile or potentially hostile population, your rules of engagement are going to be very different than when you are engaged in policing a largely peaceful civilian population. There was also a program that began in the 2000s where military equipment would be made available to local area police departments. And a fair amount has been written on this. And not long ago, there were studies done that show that police departments that were the recipients of this equipment had measurably higher, up to 130% higher rates of increase of civilian deaths within those places where this equipment was utilized. And it seems to support a general argument that the kind of militarization that we experienced and the rules and the tactics, rules of force and tactics we used overseas against others are now the kinds of tactics and rules of engagement that we use against the other, if you will, minority groups and others in our own population. And I think it underscores our need as Christians, if we care about this, and I suppose the question is, how does this impact mass incarceration? Well, if encounters on the streets are more likely to lead to violent outcomes, it's more probable that it will also end with more people going to prison. And also, if we're seeing more violence in the streets, you can only believe that there are, in fact, higher levels of escalation of use and force behind prison doors, which we don't as easily observe. So both the increase in prison numbers as well as a more brutal treatment on the streets and in prisons can be connected to this kind of militarization of police tactics. And I think is something that Christians should be genuinely concerned with and care about and speak to as citizens. The second experience I had that causes me to perhaps have an insight into this mass incarceration question. Shortly after I worked for the DC government, I went and I worked for a major DC corporation, corporate law firm. I went there in good part because they had a religious institutions practice, which was my primary concern. But they also had a niche practice in representing a growing segment of the market in private prison industry. And because of my background in the DC government, I was assigned to work in that area a bit as well. And I became, for the first time, familiar with what was going on with the privatization and commercialization of prisons, both at the state and at the federal level. And it concerned me even then a bit, as someone who was quite committed to constitutional rights. The private prison groups would want to make arguments that they were not bound by the Constitution, for instance, because you know that the majority of the Bill of Rights is applicable to government actors. Now, for the most part, the courts reject that because the private prisons are standing in the shoes of government agencies. But depending on the jurisdiction, there's always the desire for the private prisons to make these arguments. And I was certainly resisting it at the time, but not all lawyers have that kind of perspective. And you can see a slippery slope as you move away from government actors to private actors. There's a danger of these civil rights being watered down. Of course, the argument for private prisons is that they're more efficient, they save money, they can be of higher quality. But the studies that have happened show that mostly these things aren't true, that there really isn't a private savings, there really isn't a savings for the public sector. And one of my major concerns is that prisons aren't susceptible to a business model. This is a public trust. This is a question of public stewardship that should be carried out as a public matter, not as a private profit-making enterprise. And in fact, the statistics and studies show that prison officers in the private system are paid less, lower salaries significantly than those in public prison systems. They have less experience, less training, and the conditions are less safe. Furthermore, the prison industry has an incentive to try to increase the number of inmates in their prisons and engage in lobbying efforts to minimize probation, to maximize sentences, to stiffen penalties for crimes. And those are just the legal activities, right? I mean, there have been cases that some of you are probably familiar with where judges got payoffs by private prison organizations to send juveniles in higher numbers to their. So there's the problem of corruption that's harder and more difficult to monitor. Now, it's not that most of our prisoners are in private prisons. There's only about 1 in 10 from what I could find, but it's grown by 50% over the last decade or so. Even as prison numbers overall are on the decline to some degree, 10% overall decline, but 50% increase in private prisons. So it's something that Christians need to care about. I understand that the current new federal administration is moving away from that model. And I think as Christians, we should, as Christian citizens, do what we can to discourage our state governments from engaging in that kind of model, because it just worsens this issue of mass incarceration. And for my third and final point, I'd like to talk, in fact, very directly about Christian involvement and influence on these issues. I was part of a coalition in the late 1990s after the Religious Freedom Restoration Act was knocked down. We attempted to replace it, and a coalition from left to right, the ACLU and the People for the American Way, to the Christian Legal Society, and everything in between. And so we were sitting around strategizing, and somebody raised the issue of prisoners. It would make it more difficult, in many people's eyes, for states to accept a state lobbyist to accept a general religious freedom bill if prisoners were included in it, because prisoners are a litigious bunch, and that it would make it hard for states to accept that there would now be special protections for prisoners' religious freedom. And it was a key moment in the discussion. And I remember one of my mentors, the Council for the Christian Legal Society, which is a relatively conservative group, and often conservative groups are all for law and order. But Steve McFarland is his name. I haven't seen him for years, but I so admire the speech that he gave. He stood up and he said, "My Lord was a prisoner. The Bible has a lot of things to say about prisoners and their basic dignity before God. And I will not stand to see prisoners put on the sidelines of this religious freedom bill." And there were a number of us who felt similarly convicted as he did, and led a kind of effort and charge that not only were prisoners kept in, but when the coalition fell apart for various reasons, we were able to focus on two issues: religious land use and prisoners. And so there is a bill called the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Society that protects the thing that we thought would make it very difficult to pass the bill to begin with, the religious rights of prisoners. And our call was that prisoners, they need to pay their debt to society. By committing a crime, they lose certain rights, but they don't lose this fundamental question of being in the image of God and having the fundamental dignity and right to continue to worship God until they are no longer in existence, right? As long as they're alive, they're human, and they deserve this fundamental right of religious freedom. And it was the Christian lawyer who made this argument at a key moment in the progress of this legislation. And I want to suggest that Steve McFarland and those like him stand in a tradition of great prison reform activists, going back to William Wilberforce and the Clapham sect, the Quakers, Elizabeth Fry. Many of the great prison reform movements in the last 200 or 300 years have had Christians at their center, moving forward to protect the rights, to protect the image of God in prisoners who are often the lowest and the most marginalized in our society. And so I would encourage everyone here to become familiar with this Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. And it is something that is that everyone can use as a tool to make sure that inmates have access to their religious studies, to their religious books, to chaplains, to Bible study groups. And in many ways, it's kind of the fundamental right that helps keep the other rights in place, right? It gives them access to outsiders, it gives them access to basic dignity, and it's something that other rights can be also revitalized and kept alive and helped by. And so Christians, I think, should still play a central role, both in their advocacy for religious freedom for prisoners, as well as caring about these other issues that I've just gone over. So that's my presentation, and I look forward to questions.
Good evening on the East Coast, at least. I know we're literally located in many different time zones. Happy to be here. So I'm going to share my screen and share with you a PowerPoint presentation. There we go. So this talk today draws heavily from my book, published in 2017, entitled Convicted and Condemned. And for those that are on Twitter, after the Q&A, you want to continue this conversation, there is my Twitter handle. So let's start off with what the previous two presenters talked about, is this idea of punishment being woven into different areas of society, be it through the courts, through policing, through other institutions. And really, we have to look at history to know, history and the present time really, to know that punishment is a governing model. That when we create those things called punishment, they're created by politicians. And we've traditionally in the United States drawn from the traditional 9 infamous crimes created by British judges, and that politicians then set the punishment. But these punishments have, of course, changed over time. We don't do death by gallows, but we now have the death penalty, which is, of course, using other forms of ways to kill people. We still have different instances of hard labor. We also then continue to use stigma. And the stigma now is a word known as a felony conviction, but there were times where criminals would be punished through mutilation, ear cropping, cutting off a hand, slitting the nostrils, branding, public whipping, or the pillory. And so the whole idea of punishment was to create a lasting stigma, to really ostracize the individual, but also ostracize their family. So when we think about this ostracization, it now is no longer sort of acceptable to use the physical branding, the pillory. So we now use what is known as a felony conviction. If you're charged with a felony in the United States, usually it is punishable up to 1 year in prison. And then politicians over time have expanded what is considered a felony crime. So carjacking, auto theft, crimes against women and children, controlled substances, and then sex crimes. And in doing so with the traditional 9 and then traditional 9 crimes, and then with these new crimes, politicians have created this 2 sets of people in society. There are felons and then there's non-felons. And unfortunately, felons experience a civil death due to the loss of rights. So before I actually contextualize those loss of rights, I wanted to let people know more about re-entry, that traditional path of being released from prison and then coming home. So re-entry encompasses everything that you would need to think about with regards to leaving prison and re-entering society. So public policies. What do public policies say about housing and education, healthcare, and employment and other areas as it relates to a felony conviction? Politics and the rhetoric of being tough on crime is woven through policies. We also have to, in the United States in particular, think about race and racism and policing and the criminalization of others, which Professor Miller just talked about. But we also then, in this area of prisoner reentry, we got to think about the individual. What are their lived experiences? What do they suffer from? What are they experiencing? And so many individual participants in my research experience food insecurity. They experience fractured families, homelessness, poverty, mental health challenges, but also trauma. So this whole idea of all of this is involved in reentry, but then also bringing home the trauma of actually serving time in prison. So reentry in the United States occurs in rural, urban, and suburban communities. The majority of individuals leaving prison return to majority urban communities, or what we call urban core communities. So this makes reentry a place and space question. It's where are services available that can actually help those adults re-entering society? Where are those services? Where are those nonprofit organizations? And now what usually happens is that the prisoner reentry becomes a very local issue. It's a local challenge. It must be dealt with at the local issue, at the local level. So it's also important to think about who is coming home. So we know people are being released, but who is coming home? Approximately, and the numbers shift because of COVID and the de-incarceration of people, but approximately 2 million people are incarcerated in state and federal prisons and local jails. 1 in 5 are imprisoned for a drug offense. Oops, screen is stuck. Over 95% of the imprisoned population is released eventually. So these that are not sentenced to death or those that have life without parole will eventually be released. This means because of the numbers of being released, it's approximately 650 to 750,000 men and women re-enter society every year after serving time in prison or jail. Of those that are coming home, the majority are racial minorities. So we're talking about Black people, Latinos, we're talking about Native Americans, we're talking about anybody of color that's not white. And the large and growing segment of this returning population are Black women, based on percentages. Black women are increasing in the number of them coming home from prison, but that also means due to their high incarceration rates previously. So when I talked about modern civil death, these are punishments after the criminal sentence. so that public policies at the local, state, and national level literally restrict people from accessing certain public benefits, what we would traditionally call welfare. So SNAP is the food stamps. And food stamps are based on the law. Individuals are eligible to actually receive. But because of discretion of administrators that actually determine who is eligible, individuals with a felony conviction are excluded. And this happens across all of these different policies. So TANF is the temporary, oh, I think I spelled it wrong. It's the temporary assistance for needy families. It is it replaced traditional welfare. Pell Grants are for education. Parental rights can be severed. So a parent can literally lose rights to parent their child because of a felony conviction. Section 8 is related to public housing. And then there's all these other areas that literally, if you have a felony conviction in this country, there are major barriers that you must overcome if you are able to even be able to access certain rights. So this is a physical, or sorry, a picture of what I'm talking about. So when you think about overcoming these restrictions based in public policies, on the left-hand side, you see an example of the Americans with Disability Act and how it accommodates differences. And then on the right-hand side, this would definitely be something that is not compliant with the American with Disabilities Act. And so this visual really does express, on the right-hand side is the laws are not catering to, do not address individuals coming home from prison. In fact, they are restricted. Individuals coming home are restricted, and policies make it that much harder for individuals to actually come home. So this is another physical description. If you think about a physical disability, if you are elderly, if you have a physical disability and you cannot push yourself up off the toilet, you need access to the handlebar. But in this picture, as you can see, the handlebar is so far removed, an individual would be stuck, unfortunately, on the toilet. And that is not physically on the toilet, but individuals coming home get stuck. They're unable to overcome these restrictions. And this is another physical representation of a dead end, where individuals coming home are literally not able to navigate. They may be able to get partway up the ramp, and then they hit a blockage, and they're not able to then overcome their individual challenges, but then won't be able to overcome the policies that restrict their ability to live in society. And so this is the idea of the handrail is in the wrong direction. And so right now, when you're trying to re-enter society, if you've got a felony conviction on your public record, individual men and women are coming home and there's no assistance. There's not even a handrail that can actually help someone do better after serving time in society, or serving time in prison, excuse me. And so I just want to share briefly the lived experiences of some of my participants as what they described when they came home and how hard it was. So a 60-year-old man, he went by the nickname Spurgis. He said, "No one tells you re-entry is so hard. No one. Re-entry is hard, harder than expected." Gary, a 48-year-old Black man, really talked about how re-entry, you'll be constantly judged. That's hard. The conviction holds you down. People just see the conviction and you're a felon to them. And this idea that Gary, when he was perceived, when he was looked at by other people, all they saw was his felony conviction. They didn't see his humanity. They didn't see his generosity. They didn't see his potential. They only saw his felony conviction. Katrina, a 48-year-old Black woman, literally told me, they want for me to fail. How are we supposed to make it? Like, she felt, despite serving time in prison, despite being able to re-enter, or at least be released from prison. She was struggling to re-enter, and she felt like this whole system wanted her to fail. And then Carmen, she's a 38-year-old Black woman, literally said, "Ain't no help coming. It's all on me. Me. I got to do all of this." And what she was referring to is that she was responsible for her own reentry. There was no help coming. There was no public accommodations or assistance. And she was struggling with this whole idea of how does she put her life together when she's not able to access a lot of the public benefits that would otherwise help her be able to then stay away from crime and re-enter society. So my whole idea and bringing this to an almost close is that I call for a humanistic approach to reentry. Reentry is overwhelming for individuals. It requires system collaboration. So housing has to talk to employers, they have to talk to then service providers to help families deal with trauma. And the services and policies need to focus on the whole person. So it's not just housing and the physical space and employment and dealing with food and security and transportation and education, but it's around those individual issues. Does someone have any physical health issues? Are they dealing with mental health issues? Do they need help and counseling with family reunification? What kind of vocational training or other training would they be interested in pursuing? Do they have weather appropriate wardrobe and clothing? And a big challenge in the United States is being able to get a picture ID for those that are returning. So this humanistic approach is really thinking about what does the whole person need, and then in ways we can help, because we have to acknowledge each individual has different skills, family support, and mental health and physical well-being. But there's also multiple ways to re-enter. There's not just one way to leave prison and re-enter society. And unfortunately, there's no one policy solution that will address re-entry. We got to think big picture. We got to think about different ways of talking about, but also talking about re-entry, but also the policies related to re-entry. And so to reform this re-entry process, we need to think about the individual and their potential rather than focusing only on their past. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for those incredible presentations. My mind is buzzing and I have so many questions, and we have more questions coming in from the audience. So I encourage those of you watching to keep them coming, and we're going to incorporate as many as possible. I guess I just want to start off by asking each of you something that's a little bit, I guess, forward thinking. So for Professor Gohara, you talked a lot about the kind of that we need to move beyond this kind of like mercy and grace approach to decarcerating people or to thinking about, you know, why we should reduce the size of our prison system and release people from prison and not to sentence them under such harsh sentencing provisions. And so I guess I'm wondering what moral values, maybe what Christian values you think it's going to take to begin to get people to address the educational and neighborhood neglects that you talked about, which seems to be really required to get at these larger conditions that your talk so eloquently pointed us towards. For Dr. Miller, I was really struck by the parallels that you drew at the end of your talk, and drawing our attention to the role of Christian groups historically in serving and drawing awareness to the conditions of prison and seeking to build social movements and awareness around prison reforms. And so I guess I'd love to hear you talk to us about the specific role that you think that Christian or religious groups can play in advancing racial justice causes today. And for Dr. Middlemass, I really, one of the things I really got out of your talk was the notion of civil death, because I think that, when the idea of mass incarceration being a new Jim Crow, I think, that concept of Jim Crow applies really to the obstacles and the bars that people with criminal convictions face as they come home from prison, and the kind of civic restrictions mirror the segregationist regime of Jim Crow very much. So I think, the new Jim Crow concept for me really takes hold and really took hold during your talk. And so I'm just wondering how you see the landscape of reentry moving forward, because it does seem, as we're kind of embarking on this in this moment of decarceration, that there's going to be more people coming out, and so there are already a number of approaches in play. And so I just love to hear you talk about what the future of reentry should be or is.
Thank you. I think fundamentally, actually, and I was thinking about this when Professor Middlemass was speaking as well, we have to take care of the poor, right? And that's a fundamental Christian tenet. We have to take care of the poor. And in this country, as Professor Hinton has written about so extensively, we have decided not to take care of the poor. We've decided to divest from neighborhoods. We've decided to strip individuals of the opportunity for public support. We've decided to criminalize poverty. We've decided to bar people with criminal convictions from public or subsidized housing. We've decided we've decided to disallow them from having Pell Grants that would permit them to have an affordable education. And so this is the opposite of what we're called on to do by, I think, every major religious tradition. And I think that this is where we've really stumbled as a nation. And what we see time and again is that throughout somebody's life course, if you're a poor person, you're much, much more likely to be criminalized for behavior that wealthy people are not. And, one of my heroes is Susan Burton, who, if you all haven't heard of her, she's a person who cycled in and out of prison because of addiction fueled by trauma, multiple traumas. And now she has started a network of safe houses for women returning to Los Angeles from California state prisons. And she does not accept funding that ties her organization to any sort of surveillance or post-release supervision or anything like that. She just gives people a safe, non-judgmental place to heal. And what she says is that upon her last time being released from prison, a family member gave her some resources that allowed her to go to a rehabilitation center in Malibu. She grew up in South Central LA. And she realized at that point that wealthy people who have addiction get to go to yoga. And people who are poor who have addiction get sent to prison. And she wasn't even offered diversionary programs that she found out that a white cellmate of hers was being offered for her. The white cellmate was also impoverished, but was nevertheless white and was getting diversionary programs. So this is the issue from what the period of time that I'm talking about to the period of time that Professor Middlemass is talking about. Is we don't support the poor. And I'll just say make one more observation and then yield. But Clyde Meikle, the client that I talked about, is incarcerated in a unit in the Cheshire Correctional Institution that's modeled on German rehabilitative programs that the state of Connecticut, the governor and the then DOC commissioner went to Germany with the Vera Institute of Justice some years ago, and they saw how a different model of thinking about incarceration and in Germany. And I had the opportunity to go on Yale funded fellowship to go visit 3 prisons in Germany. And time and again, people would say to me, our job as custodians of incarcerated people is to heal them. It's to make sure that they have services to heal. It's not to further punish them. Incarceration is punishment enough. When they go home, they should be better than when they came in. That is not how the United States, most correctional departments think about the people in their custody. They think that they're there to incapacitate and deter at best. And many believe that they are there to inflict further punishment. And Dr. Miller talked about some of that a little bit as well in terms of the way people are treated behind bars and out of view. And that is fundamentally different from what people in other Western democracies think. many of them, and it makes a huge difference. And so why was Clyde Meikle able to have this extraordinary rehabilitation? Largely because he did it himself, but also because the DOC decided to implement a new rehabilitative model. So that's some of what I have to say. And one more thing that I learned in Germany, a social worker who was assigned by the government to reach out to people and make sure that they had access and help, assistance. The opposite of what Dr. Middlemass was talking about, making sure people had assistance to access services, said to me, of course, we believe that if one member of our community is not doing well, then the entire community is not doing well. Now, I'm not here to suggest that every German feels that way, but that was a perspective that was presented to me, and I don't hear that often enough here in the United States.
So, as to what religious groups can help to deal with the problems behind bars, and I think you specifically mentioned racial inequities. I think at the basic level, religious organizations should take seriously their prison ministries to their members behind bars. I know that my church has a relatively robust prison ministry, and that's how I get involved when I hear stories of inmates being denied religious literature, or the chaplain, the Bible worker can't visit, and we get involved, write a letter, call the warden. And the fundamental question is, incarceration involves a loss of dignity, right? A loss of dignity and basic respect. There's a dehumanization that takes place that has a cycle to it that leads to and contributes to the difficulties upon exit. And religion at its core is about helping people retain their dignity, right, in their own eyes and in the eyes of others. And if you remind prison officials that this person has a right that extends beyond you, you are not the ultimate authority in this person's life, the government isn't, God is, and this person still has a relationship with that God, you are sending a message not just to that prisoner, but to the larger prison community. And I think every religious organization, most of them have members behind bars, right? It's not hard to justify. You get involved, you have a prison ministry. And then I think that gives you a foundation also then to try to speak to some of these larger societal issues about police brutality and force. And Adventists are very good at preventive medicine on the physical side. We're well known for helping people change their diet and lifestyle and preventing problems before they happen. But I have to confess, as a people, we're less good at that on some of these other issues. And we have good prison ministries, but we forget to make the extension to, but we're also citizens in society, and we could have an impact on some of the, at least the intermediate causes of these. And so I think education to members like of my own church, saying, yeah, you care for prisoners, but do you care how they got there and why there are so many there of a certain color? And surely Christ would care about these things, and trying to move the education in that direction of opposing police brutality on the streets, as well as privatization and commercialization of prisons, is something that religious people of all faiths should get behind. So to start.
So this concept of reentry moving forward, and of course it's such a deeper issue than some policies that are in place and that restrict people, but the idea of reentry being a local issue also has to start then at the local places where people are coming home. And so my fear is that it will be very, very hard to change the current policies just because of the politics of crime. And we hear tough on crime because politicians don't want them to be challenged about being soft on crime. And there's a whole history of politicians navigating the crime issue and wanting to look tougher and tougher and tougher so that they can win at the ballot box. And they don't really care so much about who is locked up. And that is part of the problem, is what was discussed earlier, is we don't care about the poor anymore. We don't care about people of color, and we definitely don't care about the LGBTQ community, and we marginalize all these different groups simply because they're not white Christians, or even just white, like regardless of their religious denomination. So moving forward, I am of the advocate that you got to educate people, individuals, more about prisoner reentry, because the idea that it's somewhere else is actually becoming more and more rare. That prisoner reentry happens all across the United States in different types of communities, and it may not be visible unless you understand what it looks like. And so reaching out, and instead of, if you're cleaning out your closets, COVID, you're cleaning out your closets, there are so many programs that you can donate your clothes to those that are re-entering. And the weather appropriate clothes are so important, particularly in the Northeast and Northern states when it's winter. We think about volunteering and helping the poor, but volunteering at a soup kitchen literally can help someone get food for the day. And I know this doesn't change the whole big picture reentry, but if you can help one person do better that one day, they then can track multiple days together and have an opportunity to get on their feet. And sometimes it's as simple as, I've got clothes, I've got a safe place to sleep, I've got regular food, and that means that I can now think about how to engage with society, because it's without the basics, it would be hard for any of us to actually function well in society.
Yeah, one of the things, I recently read Reuben Jonathan Miller's new book called Halfway Home, which I'm sure you're familiar with, Dr. Middlemass. And one of the things that he talked about that just made so much, like light bulbs went off, was when he talked about the favor economy, and just how much, when people are released, depend on favors, like depend on you going to a soup kitchen and volunteering so they can eat, because there's like, they have no resources. There are not, the options aren't there. And I think too, in terms of, thinking about the kind of landscape of both incarceration and reentry right now, Dr. Miller's emphasis on privatization is really important, and kind of the dangers on, incarcerating people or providing services for people in a privatized model, because so many reentry programs are privatized, meaning that like you're gonna provide people who are returning home with the minimal resources possible so that you can get the most profit from running a reentry program. And so, many of the private reentry programs are causing more harm than good. And within the prison system, even though less than 10% of state and federal prisons are privatized, within the immigration detention system in immigrant prisons, which half of which are privatized, the conditions are just abysmal. And, we already know so little. We have access to, it's not transparent what's actually happening in immigration detention prisons in the US, but in privatized ones, even less so. And so when you're, detaining immigrants for profit, again, and over half of the immigration detention system is private, it just makes no sense in a democracy. All right, we've got lots of great questions coming in from the audience. The first one is from Jason Miller. And Jason Miller asks, if issues of criminal justice are political, how do we work to ensure they don't just become partisan issues? Or if we do, won't that harm our ability to bring change in our communities?
They're already partisan. And so I encourage everybody, when you think about elections, don't skip over the local elections, because local politicians and state politicians actually make more criminal justice and social service policies than the federal government. But the federal offices, President, Congress, get more attention in the media. But those individuals at the local level, the prosecutor, who is prosecuting crimes in your jurisdiction, they are going to actually have more power over who gets diversion programs and who doesn't and ends up going into prison. Who is on your city council and who is your mayor that is going to sign off on those police contracts? Show up to city council meetings and challenge, like, why are you signing this? why are you spending $8 million for a few days worth of policing, but you can't service or provide money for affordable or low income housing? It's really the local and state officials that we as a democracy, as a voting public, need to hold account.
And I'll just add, it certainly is a political issue, but I'm encouraged that on this one, it's not just purely a left-right divide, is it? There have been, you know, I told a little story about Steve McFarland, the Christian Legal Society, a more right-wing organization, and their passion for prison rights. And you know, more recently, I recall reading about the Koch brothers, the famous right-wing conservative funders, were deeply concerned about prison reform and have funded activities on that. So there's a lot of shared concerns that can cross the aisle if you build your coalitions, I think, carefully. A lot of religious people who are conservative but see the importance of prison ministries and having a fair criminal justice system. So you're absolutely right about local level, but also let's try to build some bridges on this.
No, it's an excellent point, and thank you for adding that, because it's not a left-right ideological question. It's who are those individuals that think the same way about reforming the system and building those coalitions. You're so right. Yes.
I would just add too that, you know, one of the things that my work really emphasizes is that the issue of crime control and of targeting police forces in low-income communities of color has been really the domestic policy issue in the last 50 years that conservatives and liberals, Democrats and Republicans have consistently agreed on. And the two largest and most consequential pieces of federal law enforcement legislation post-civil rights, Lyndon Johnson's Omnibus Crime Control and Safe Streets Act of 1968 and the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 were enacted during the administrations of two presidents that are considered liberal. And both of these policies vastly expanded the criminal legal system. So, you know, the problem is really, it is partisan in the sense that, you know, a lot of times the issues of law and order and rhetoric gets used in elections. And, you know, Clinton himself wanted to, you know, asserted himself on law and order and that he was tough on crime in order to take back the issue from Reagan and the Republicans. But, you know, it goes much deeper than that. It really is a systemic problem that, again, is the domestic issue that that conservatives and liberals have agreed on in recent decades. Okay, let's take another one. This one is actually for Professor Gohara, and it's from Faith Nico. And she asks, when it comes to sentencing, how can the balance be achieved between justice for those affected or harmed and mercy and grace for the guilty party or parties? It's a really good question.
It's such a good question. And as Professor Hinton knows, I'm deeply interested and concerned with the impact of criminal legal system policies on crime victims. And so let me start by saying that I believe and know firmly from my experience that the spectrum or line between victim and offender or perpetrator is a very blurry one, because as I mentioned at the outset, what we find time and again is that our clients have been victimized or witnessed awful violence or harm in their communities long before they hurt anybody else. And they go from essentially being on or underprotected children to being people who struggle, have issues, have problems that are perfectly identifiable and predictable. And then they commit a crime or they hurt somebody else, and then they're criminalized, and everyone shuts the door on the idea that they were ever vulnerable people who also were themselves were harmed. So that's one of the reasons why this issue interests me so much. But there is undoubtedly a category of crimes where somebody is just harmed somebody who never harmed them, who never had anything to do with the immediate proximate causes of their environmental deprivations. And that's really tough. And unfortunately, those events end up, of course, getting a disproportionate attention by the media and by politicians and so forth. And they tend to fuel and drive our criminal legal policies rather than thinking more holistically about the people who are sort of on both sides of that victim, offender, perpetrator divide. With that said, the problem with our current criminal legal system is that when we incarcerate people and we put them in prison and we lock them away, we're also not really holding them accountable. We may be punishing them, but that's not going to give the victims or the people who have been harmed by their actions any sort of satisfaction. And Danielle Sered has an amazing book called Until We Reckon. And it really talks about this issue of holding people accountable in a meaningful way, not just permitting people to say sorry, but asking them to do sorry. So what does doing sorry mean? Doing sorry means things like actually having to come to terms face to face, either with the victim in your case or a similarly situated victim, because sometimes the victims in a particular case don't want to see or have anything to do with the person who hurt them, but there may be opportunities to work with other crime victims or to make redress in a different way to a community of people who have been harmed. It means actually taking the time to be restored and repaired such that you can gain insight. So you're not just trying to survive in prison, you're not just trying to survive the danger and violence of prison, but you're protected enough to actually be able to go inward and figure out what it is that you have to come to terms with to be a better person and to do better. And that counts for people even who are incarcerated for the rest of their lives. I mean, I don't want there to be a world in which we incarcerate people for the rest of their lives here in the United States, but we do have that circumstance. So even people who spend the rest of their lives in prison have ample opportunities to do good behind bars and to do good for themselves and other people and to build community and to educate and to teach and to preach. Faith communities in prison are incredibly important and uplifting for so many incarcerated people. And so to me, the issue that we have, and again, there are so many eloquent people who speak to this. Sujata Balaga is someone who I recommend strongly. She's been on a number of podcasts that speak to this so powerfully. The idea that the current criminal legal system is doing nothing to actually stop the cycles of harm and violence because it's not addressing these underlying issues that we are. So that's really forsaking victims in a much more fundamental way. Even if the person who hurt me gets put away for the rest of his life, this issue and this cycle are going to continue. And then I've just seen incredibly powerful and moving opportunities for restorative justice, even among the most harmed and aggrieved people who have lost children to violence, the worst possible imaginable loss. And the last thing I'll say is that there are amazing organizations like Survivors for Safety and Justice who are really looking for a different model. They acknowledge and recognize that not all crime victims are seeking the same thing. Not all crime victims are seeking maximum punishment. Many are seeking the kind of investment in communities that we're talking about that will help to make communities more fundamentally safe for everybody.
Thank you so much for that. All right, keep the questions coming in, everyone. These are really, really great. The next one is from Marsha Correa. I apologize if I botched your last name. And Marsha asked, can the panelists speak to the role of militarism of prison officials, guards, and correctional officers and the relationship to over-policing communities?
Well, I guess I was the one that touched on that, wasn't I? And I guess we've seen the militarization most clearly in the police officer environment, because that's where we have the video cameras and the cell phones. And so I know less about the statistics inside prisons, so it's hard, but I can only believe that the same thing is happening that we're seeing happening on the law enforcement on the outside is also happening on the inside. We're just less aware of it because most inmates don't have cell phone cameras and the public isn't there. And it's this question of the escalation of the use of force is something that we've seen with our very own eyes. And it's just, we're in a different environment where those in charge of security, whether it's on the streets or in prisons, feel somehow empowered, I guess literally with all the military equipment that they have from the government, to escalate the response far more rapidly than we traditionally have called for, and far more rapidly than I think is justified under the Constitution or under basic moral rules. You know, the question is, what can we do about it as citizens? And I just think that there's, you know, with the recent protests and whatnot we've had, I think the whole defund the police slogan is not a great idea, because that just leaves poor and vulnerable communities without important protections that they need. But I do think that civilian oversight boards, more transparent training, the enforcement of the use of body cameras, all these things are things that Christian citizens should care about and should speak to in their communities and get involved with as opportunity arises.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that too, that, you know, this militarism and this militarization runs really deep, and we're reaping the consequences of more than a half century of the transfers from the military to domestic law enforcement that Dr. Miller spoke of. So this began in the 1960s when Lyndon Johnson called the war on crime and began the process of transferring surplus military technology, so tanks from Vietnam, tanks, helicopters, M4 carbine rifles, gas masks, tear gas, and other kinds of chemical weapons that were being used in Vietnam and interventions in Latin America to targeted low-income communities of color in the United States. And remember, you know, this was the era when many communities were erupting, they were rebelling. Some people call this rioting, in response to the socioeconomic conditions that were being unanswered that Professor Gohara talked about so eloquently. And the response, you know, was not, and this is a running theme of many of our conversations and presentations, was not to deal with the root causes, was not to invest in jobs for marginalized Americans, in educational opportunities, not the remedial education programs of the war on poverty, but in real educational advancement and into a pathway to full citizenship and inclusion. Instead, these communities got the war on crime and they got a militarized police force. And the consequences of that we're still dealing with today. And 50 years later, we've seen the ways in which those practices have really ramped up under decades of zero tolerance in policing that's been targeted again in low-income communities of color. But I think that the militarism in kind of the culture of law enforcement, which I think is part of what your question was getting at too, kind of reflects the options that many low-income Americans face right now. Because, you know, in many communities, especially if you don't have access to educational opportunities, your choices are go to the Army, join the military, become a cop, become a prison guard, or go to prison yourself. And, you know, so much of this reflects just the limited options due to our domestic priorities that have privileged the expansion of policing and prison systems. And yeah, I mean, I guess many of the people, you know, another strong connection is that many of the people that do serve in the military then return home and become law enforcement officers or prison guards. So there is a kind of running connection between U.S. militarism in general and crime control. And it's in part the ethos, the general ethos and the othering that we've been talking about. It's in part the literal technology transfers from the military to law enforcement. And it's also in the fact that many of the people who join the military then come home and become cops and prison guards because those are really good jobs with good benefits.
And we also have to think about this context of where are prisons located. And if a lot of states, they're in the rural areas, not all states, but a lot of prisons are located in rural communities. And so the prison guard job for those in the rural community might be the best paying job with benefits for those that don't have beyond a high school diploma. But that also means that you've got majority white prison guards literally guarding and correctional officers over a largely minority-based incarcerated population. And so you've got these racial dynamics that play out into who is guarding who, right, but also the idea of the power structure. And it's not the institutionalized power, but it's the power of one guard over black body or a white guard over black bodies that really does cause some tension inside.
Can I just jump in 1 second? I feel like we would be remiss not to mention probation and parole, because when people come out, there are actually many, many more people who are under correctional supervision who are out in the community under probation or parole department supervision than there are incarcerated. And the same dynamics are at play. Many of the same folks who find these government jobs to be very the best available options to them choose to do so in the context of this kind of supervision, and the dynamics can be very different. Someone can see their job as much more of a social work kind of context, or they can see themselves as much more of a law enforcement enforcer type. And that makes a big difference because people end up cycling back into prison for small, minor, sometimes technical and non-criminal violations of their probation or parole. And just again, to contrast with Germany, in Germany, the prison guards across the board have to undergo like 2 years of significant postgraduate training in many different disciplines before they're allowed to be prison guards. It's actually a very, very vaunted career, and one that's very well respected. And that's very different. Our correctional officers also experience incredible trauma, and they're asked to carry out executions, and they're asked to do a lot of incredibly difficult work without a lot of support. And so it's a problem. And I think that's, to go back to the question of depoliticizing the issue, there could actually be some common ground around this. In that TRUE unit that I talked about, where my client Clyde Meikle is, the job satisfaction among the correctional officers and counselors in there is much, much better than it is in the general population. And there's been not a single violent incident in that unit. And so we could be doing this differently for everybody who's involved in incarceration and supervision.
Can I just, I'd like to just pick up on that point you just made, and the comparison to Germany that you've drawn us to several times, Professor Gohara, which I really appreciate. And, you know, thinking about Professor Middlemass's emphasis at the beginning of her talk on punishment, I'd love to hear you all reflect on why you think that the US, which is of course home to the largest prison system in world history, why the US punishes so harshly. You know, what do you think explains that? And why, you know, are lawmakers and officials so resistant, consistently resist the model of Germany and the Netherlands and other countries that offer a more humane and effective form of rehabilitating people who have caused harm to society?
Wow, that's a great question. And I can see nobody's really totally anxious to jump in. We're like, well, yes, there's the answer. I mean, you know, it's a great question, because American public policy on many things has been, I don't know, we've had a separation of church and state here that has been helpful to our religious vibrancy and our religious freedom. We're known for providing compassionate and humanitarian support around the world and bringing reforms elsewhere. And yet you're right. I mean, our incarceration system, our jail system is one of the worst in the world as far as per capita of people are imprisoned. And, you know, I just think that Michelle Alexander's book probably explains a lot, doesn't it? These other countries don't have a massive population that they, you know, accumulated under slavery, kept in place during Jim Crow and so forth. And now you have a massive underclass that you feel you have to control in some way. And I think she's just opened a lot of our eyes up to the fact that, you know, this is mass ethnic racial control of a disfavored underclass. And when you see the disparate penalties for, you know, drugs used by whites versus drugs used by blacks, I mean, it's kind of the elephant in our room, right? Here we are. Why do we have this big thing? Well, we had this whole history of slavery and Jim Crow that none of these other nations have. So we have this whole population that you know, middle white America has to somehow control and keep safe. And thus we have the prison industrial complex. I don't know if it's that overt in terms of most people thinking about it explicitly that way these days, but I think she makes the case that that's how it's unfolded. And as a historian, that's the most convincing explanation I've seen.
Yes. The various forms of social control in this country have really targeted Black communities, but over time, it's not just the Black community and enslavement, but just think about the Walk of Tears in Native Americans. The idea of how we have this immigration rhetoric against brown people, and they're all South American, and the former president saying he wanted immigrants from, was it Sweden, Norway? I forgot which country he focused on. But the idea of those coming to this country were demonized, not because of anything spectacular, but basically because their ethnicity and or their racial identity. And that feeds a lot of our public policies over time, despite politicians no longer, well, do not expressly state their racial fears or their disgust of certain others. It's woven into public policies with race neutral language, but have disparate racial impact. And that's important to look at the impact of public policies.
I have a kind of fun question, and I'll answer first because I've seen the question and I had a chance to kind of prepare in my mind, and it's from Ben Dormus. And Ben Dormus asks, can each of you, including the moderator, so he invited me to join, give 1 to 3 book or study material recommendations that have helped you think about these issues? And there are so many great books on mass criminalization and incarceration and policing, especially in recent years. There's just been, you know, as these issues have kind of come to the center of domestic policy discussions, the scholarship is really incredible. But if I have to choose 3, I guess the first, and this is not in any particular order, but Khalil Muhammad's The Condemnation of Blackness is a really excellent book. And he shows how immediately after emancipation, basically policymakers and progressive reformers took the disproportionate number of Black people who were incarcerated for reasons that we've been talking about in the immediate aftermath of slavery, as statistical proof that Black people were inherently criminal. And he traces out the ways in which Blackness and criminality became really linked through the first decades of the 20th century. So The Condemnation of Blackness by Khalil Muhammad. Angela Davis has a really excellent collection of essays with Bettina Aptheker called If They Come in the Morning, which was released in the mid-70s. And Davis in particular has just a really powerful essay on incarceration that talks about the ways in which the prison system is kind of the most acute expression of American racism. And it's really fantastic, and it's had a big impact on me. And then I guess the last one would be a memoir written by Colton Simpson, who is currently incarcerated now, but was a member of the Crips. And it's called Inside the Crips. And this book really provides a what I see as one of the best, if not the best, kind of social accounts or social histories or senses of what it's actually like to be incarcerated. It's a really, really powerful book. I assign it in my class, Mass Incarceration and Historical Perspective, and my students really, really get a lot out of it. So Khalil Muhammad, The Condemnation of Blackness, Angela Davis, If They Come in the Morning, and Colton Simpson, Inside the Crips. Other reading suggestions from the panel.
So I'll jump in before. I mean, I don't have a lot of books on this, but I did mention Michelle Alexander and the New Jim Crow. I think that's a foundational and fundamental book. And then those of you interested in, keep talking about the Religious Land Use and Institutionalized Persons Act, the Department of Justice has a very good sort of question and answer sheet to explain it and how it operates and how you can practically implement it. I'm putting it in the chat. It's just a statement of the Department of Justice on the institutionalized persons provisions of the Religious Use and Institutionalized Persons Act. So those are the 2 things that I would point towards at this time.
I would I would like to give a shout out to actually Professor Elizabeth Hinton's book, From the War on Poverty to the War on Crime, the making of mass is it the making of mass incarceration? Did I get the title right? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you.
Well, no, it's an important history because it's current. It's moving people away from the issues of slavery, because people are like, oh, slavery was so far, and they sort of sometimes zone out, and you're like, no, this happened in most of our lifetime. And another book, which is comparative racial perspective, is Robert Lieberman's Shaping Race Policy. And he goes through, so Lieberman's book, Shaping Race Policy, goes through a comparison of the United States, France, and Britain. And he goes through their history, but he also then looks at the dynamics of different countries around race, but also their public policies around health insurance, around Social Security, around employment and employment insurance for those that are unemployed. And the comparison really does help people put the United States in perspective of why it is so different. I only got two because you took the other. Sorry.
I was also going to recommend Professor Hinton's book, which is I learned so much tremendously from it. It's such a meticulous history. So that is, I think, a must read. I will also recommend the book by, I'm going to recommend two writings by two other friends of mine, and then I'm going to throw in a bonus. So James Foreman's Locking Up Our Own, I think, is a really important contribution because it explains the complexity of this racial dynamic that we're talking about and the ways in which African-American policymakers and people in power harnessed concern about protecting Black communities and contributed unwittingly to mass incarceration. And Dwayne Betts, who's a person who also has lived experience having served time in prison, has written a lot, poetry, memoir, short pieces in the New York Times. And the one that I found really incredibly powerful this summer, it was ostensibly about Kamala Harris, but it was really about his grappling with the very question that the audience member asked before about victimization and how do we actually account for holding people accountable for harm. And I think that was an incredibly powerful piece in the New York Times Magazine. And the bonus is The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. She's got Cast Out right now, which is really popular, but I actually think this book is seminal. I think it really explains a lot of the dynamic that we're talking about with the continued containment, divestment, and racial hatred, really, that pursued people who were escaping racial terrorism in the South when they migrated to northern cities.
Yeah, The Warmth of Other Suns is a really great book. I was just in a conversation with some friends of mine, and we were talking about Cast the Warmth of Other Suns, and that is the must-read book as far as we're concerned. Okay, so from Livian Militao, we have a question. How can we work and make the church familiar with the prison system for the religious community to be more useful if there are so much prejudice and fear among church members? How can we start to break these thoughts to help more? What can we do first? I mean, it's a really important and difficult question. Essentially, like, how do we actually deal with people's racism and prejudice in order to bring about the changes that we've been talking about?
Well, it's maybe a question sort of in my bailiwick, and a lot of church members have not been inside a prison, right? And I'm trying to think if before I worked for the District of Columbia, I'm not sure I'd ever been inside a prison. And then working as a lawyer, maximum security, minimum security, medium security, it was part of my job. And so I became very familiar with it. But most people don't have that familiarity. And I think it takes two things. Most church members, I think, once they know of a fellow church member who's behind bars somewhere, then suddenly there's a tie. This isn't just the other. This is somebody that's connected with you and your beliefs and is part of your extended family in a sense. And I think that those of us who are more familiar with prisons and going inside prisons can play a role in helping people, starting by connecting with and supporting your own members. And then there's a level of comfort you achieve that, like, oh, this is actually a place I can go and there are real people there, and it's not this scary place with these untouchable people. And it's a very personal, almost has to start off with a one-on-one thing with a little help from people who've had some experience.
Okay. So here's one from Elise Harbolt. Are there any practical steps we can take to encourage the media to contextualize the stories of the accused and incarcerated? I have a friend who was demonized by the media after committing a crime. Many false and sensational things were shared but never corrected after the trial showed them to be false. Is there anything we can do to encourage more responsible reporting? And I think in a lot of ways, this is related to the first question and answer, the previous question and answer.
I will answer at least from a certain perspective, which is, one thing is, I do feel like actually this is where social media can be helpful, because I, for one, have gently reminded like reporters or broadcasters, for example, to, would you consider changing your language from inmate to incarcerated person or persons with a history of incarceration? And over time, that really makes a difference. It really makes a difference. And so that's just a small thing, like reaching out to people on Twitter, and I'm not talking about calling people out. I'm just talking about inviting them to reconsider their language. But also, again, I think there's a lot of work that we as lawyers or our advocates can do, or scholars can do, as we begin to tell stories, because that's our job. It's to tell stories. And as we tell stories, it's inescapable. Nobody could cover the context of Clyde Meekel's sentencing modification and focus exclusively on his crime. That would be completely dishonest, because the vast majority of what was said, to the point where the prosecutor who tried him and the arresting officer who arrested him for the homicide were on board and agreed to the sentencing modification and supported it, was because of all the context that we were able to provide. And so if we do a better job of putting this information into the record, it's a lot harder for reporters, I think, to just elide that and simply only focus on the parts of the most sensational parts. Now, some are going to, that's going to happen. There's going to be reasons, political reasons. Again, I think the status of the victim makes a big difference in reporting, but people are more and more aware of it. And I think the more we work to tell more accurate stories and work with media and gently push back, I think we can have influence in those ways.
Okay, this will be the last question before we wrap up. And it kind of brings us full circle back to the issue of values that Professor Gohara raised in her remarks. And it's from Willie Alves. And he says, one of the big questions that I have noticed most is precisely this idea of revenge. Revenge is not necessarily justice. Here in Brazil, we have a giant incarceration rate as well. Yes, it's true. And the vision is one of revenge and not of solving problems. How can we change this view within the religious context? And I encourage you all to respond to that and think about how that question might lead to kind of closing or closing remarks from each of you. It's a tough question.
It's a very tough question. And now what's circling through my head is this idea of revenge. And we may not call it revenge, but it looks like revenge in practice. And it's not just the policing to the criminal justice system to prisoner reentry, but it's that is what is called the carceral continuum. There's sort of, it's a circle now where people can't get out of it. And it's not just poverty that causes crime, but it's the trauma when you're unprotected that leads to then criminal behavior. And so I do want people to leave from here that it's not poverty that causes crime, but it's that idea of those that are impoverished tend not to have the same protections. They tend not to have the same networks, the same access to assistance and help that those that are wealthier have. And poor people, like rich people, make bad decisions. So it's not sort of the whole decision making. So I'm wrestling with this idea of revenge and how can we change it, is because the system seems to be created with the idea of punishing and punishing some more. And we may have moved from more punishment with like life under parole. Like there's now lifetime parole that people are now out of prison, which is great, but now they're under the control of parole, and we're just passing the control off to other institutions. It does not answer the question, but that's the best I've got.
You know, that's great. That's phenomenal. Thank you.
You know, I think that the Christian perspective should give us some help in dealing with this, in terms of the teaching that we're all potentially saints and we're all potentially sinners, right? And that honestly, both extremes of the political spectrum suffer from their own version of cancel culture. They just have different standards that they're going to cancel you on. And maybe on the more conservative side, you know, it's the felon, it's that becomes the other. And on the left-wing side, there's other sacred cows that if you violate, right, you're just disposed of. And I hope that Christian ever keeps in mind that the felon is like you and me, right? And there, but for the grace of God, go I, given circumstances and upbringing and resources. And in dealing with the other, we're really dealing with versions of ourselves and how would we want to be treated, and do we want to have a sense of proportionality and accountability versus just, you know, revenge is just about canceling somebody else out entirely, right? You just wish they were gone. And that's in part why I've sort of dedicated my life to this notion of religious freedom, which somehow seems abstract and ephemeral. You know, you're not providing someone with actual food or clothing, or, I mean, you might be from a religious motive, but religious freedom is about supporting the dignity of everybody, whether they've crossed some cancel line on somebody's cultural side or not. They're continuing to have this dignity, and even if they're wrong, even if they need to be held accountable, they can't just be disposed of. They needed to be treated in a way that, yes, there's accountability and correction and whatever else we're talking about, but never slipping over into just cancellation and revenge.
So I would just add that in addition to the concept of there, but by the grace of God, go I, in my mind is the idea of the accident of birth, and literally how we are all just born into the circumstances in which we're born. And if we remember that, and if we remember that that's somebody else's child or mother or father that is in those shoes for some reason, and if we can bring ourselves to recognize that humanity, and again, back to this idea that we can't be hypocrites, we are failing to protect. I really liked what Professor Middlemass said. It's like, it's not that poverty that causes crime, it's failure to protect. It's if we can remember that, if we can remember all of us are complicit in that, I think that helps mitigate the idea of revenge or purely retributive punishment. And I think that can move us in a more rehabilitative and healing direction.
Thank you all so much for your enlightening and insightful comments. And thank you, audience members, for asking such amazing questions. It's really been an honor to be in conversation with all of you.
Thank you for doing such a great job, Elizabeth.
Yes, here, here. Very
Thank
nicely
you.
done. Thank you.
Yes, we definitely want to thank Professor Hinton and all our panelists for such a wonderful and informative panel discussion. I know I learned a lot more than I thought I was going to learn, because, you know, I thought there was so much more to learn, and yet I realized there was even that much more to learn. And so we know that we have a lot of work to do, and we're thanking our panelists so much for putting the issue in context. We also want to take a time at this point to thank some of our sponsors. We want to thank the Atlantic Union of Seventh-day Adventist Youth Ministries Department for sponsoring our speakers, as well as the Yale Divinity School, as well as the North American Division of Seventh-day Adventist Department of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for giving us generous donations for us to be able to put this together. We have a lot of other organizations that we work with that you'll learn about throughout the rest of the conference, but for this panel particularly, we want to thank those groups.
And I want to second Mpilo in thanking everyone who has made this a success. Already, it's off to such an exciting start. Just a few announcements going forward. Tomorrow is going to be a full day of sessions, starting at 10 a.m. and going until 7:15 p.m. And then more sessions on Sunday. And I just want to share my screen with you really quickly to show you the schedule and make sure that it is on your radar. So you should have received something like this in your email inbox that shows the entire schedule. And I think it's still loading up. But tomorrow, we are excited to have Connect, which stands for Congregations Organized for a New Connecticut, starting us off at 10 a.m. It will be just a really exciting group presentation that organization is putting on, talking about their clean slate legislation, which relates to how long a record exists after a person leaves the incarceral system. And then after that, okay, here we have it. So Saturday morning, 10 a.m. And then after that at 11:15, we're having a keynote presentation by Kevin Burton, who is presenting some very exciting material.
I can give you the title for that. It's called Unmasking the Beast, looking at how Adventist Church, using that as a case study in how Adventists have worked in antebellum America for pushing against slavery and the institutions therein. So,
thank you. So we're just so grateful to have all of you. We will send out the Zoom links again tomorrow for everyone who is in the Zoom rooms so that you'll have it at the top of your inbox. And if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at yaleadventist@gmail.com.
Awesome. Just another quick note, the YouTube link will also be available throughout the weekend. It's going to be the same YouTube channel that those of you on the YouTube were on today. It's going to be that same one. So make sure to go back there if you'd rather watch on the YouTube. But anyways, thank you all so much. We hope you all have a great night, and we hope to see you tomorrow again at 10 a.m. And again, just another thank you to our panelists, to our interpreters, both Spanish and Portuguese, and all the other staff members who've been working behind the scenes to make this a reality. We'll see you all tomorrow morning.